Thank you all so much for coming. I'm Nicole Minkoff. I'm the undergrad advisor for chemical engineering. And in case anybody can't see, I am a white woman with pale skin and brown hair pulled into a ponytail, wearing a white shirt and a gray cardigan. And I'm so excited for this conversation. Hawley and I had a chance to talk a couple times, and just about how great ChemE is for health and medicine, and understanding better why it's so great, and just her really interesting story. So I'm really pleased that we get to share that with you all tonight. So this is Hawley. She's a PhD student in the Nance lab in chemical engineering, and she's been interested in health and medicine opportunities in engineering since she began college. And she's here with us today to share why she chose chemical engineering and to tell us more about what she does. Welcome, Hawley. And Hawley's cat, it looks like.
Yeah, hi, I'm Hawley. I am a white woman in my mid-20s wearing a black turtleneck, and occasionally you'll see my tuxedo cat, Mimi, show up onto screen. She's just 8.
Great. So let's dive into our questions. The first question I have is, you were actually declared as a biomedical engineering student when you started college, and can you tell us more about how you became interested in ChemE and why it was a better fit for you as somebody who wanted to go to med school and combine engineering and medicine?
Yeah. So at Arizona State University, when you get admitted to a program, you're admitted straight to a program. And so I knew I wanted to do engineering, and I loved biology. And so I picked biomedical engineering as my field. And I actually didn't switch my major until midway through my sophomore year, which is when I switched to chemical engineering. So I started as a biomedical engineer, and I liked my first couple of courses. I took like an intro to biomedical engineering and met a bunch of professors, learned to pipette in our first laboratory. That's what we did. And I felt relatively good about it. But then looking forward at my next 4 years, I just wasn't really in love with the curriculum. We dove straight into biomedical applications, but I wasn't really learning the fundamentals. And so that was something that I felt like I had just kind of been thrown into the deep end without really building up to what the deep end meant. And then I also didn't want to spend time really talking about FDA paperwork, and I didn't really want to spend a ton of time on the administrative tasks of what went behind biological engineering. I really just wanted to be diving straight into the biology. So I started questioning if I was happy in the curriculum. And then I joined a research lab that was in biomedical engineering. So my PI was a principal investigator, was a professor in BME, but his background was in chemical engineering in his PhD and in his bachelor's degree. So I was doing biomedical engineering research on the small intestine, and not really sure if I liked my curriculum. And so one day he was like, well, you should check out chemical engineering. So I thought about it for a while, and then set up an appointment with an academic advisor who sat me down and really looked at the 2 major maps for 4 years. And he was a really fantastic academic advisor and walked me through every class. And what I saw in chemical engineering is, although it was not application first, and it's a lot broader in that chemical engineers go into energy and into oil, that it was very fundamentally supported. So you spend all this time really getting the fundamentals, really understanding how they relate to one another, and then you can apply that into biology however you want to. And that's really, really where I wanted to spend my time. And that was really what sold me on switching my major.
Very cool. And Holly and I were talking before we got started today about those fundamentals and ChemE being broader, and how over the years I've watched a lot of alumni talk about what they do with their chemical engineering degrees, and it's super, super broad. And a couple of years ago, we had someone talk about like high throughput potato processing for those like bags of frozen fries that you can buy. And then a couple weeks ago, someone talked about genomic sequencing, and it was like the same fundamentals, the same processes underlying both of those things. So it's really cool it was cool to hear about that. And sounds like it was a good fit. Another burning question that we get about chemical engineering is, do you like chemistry? And did you like chemistry when you changed to a chemical engineering degree?
Yeah. I don't remember liking chemistry in high school. I don't remember hating chemistry, but I never had this moment where I was like, oh, I love or even liked chemistry. In high school, it was definitely just something I did because you had to graduate from high school. I remember there was like one thing that was exciting, like if you burned certain chemicals, the fire turned a different color. I thought that was really cool, but never did it actually occur to me to switch to chemical engineering because I liked chemistry. Even when I switched my degree program, my entire aspect was about chemical systems within the concept of biology. And so I knew from BME, obviously, you're learning about biological engineering. But then when I switched my major, I knew in chemical engineering that you were able to learn and see the human body as just a large biochemical system. So I don't think I've ever really loved chemistry. I thought OChem was fun, but I definitely wouldn't go out of my way to say chemistry is my favorite science. It's above physics. I like it more than physics.
Great. Can you tell us about some of the opportunities you've had since you started studying chemical engineering?
Yep. So I mentioned briefly at the beginning that when I was a BME, I started research in a BME laboratory with a professor who was a professor of biomedical engineering. And so when I switched to chemical engineering, I actually stayed in his lab. So I kept doing research in a biomedical engineering lab because a lot of those fundamentals are very similar to chemical engineering fundamentals. And so that was a really great opportunity that I got there. But outside of that opportunity as a chemical engineer, I also did an internship with Sumco USA. And so Sumco USA is a Japanese company that makes the wafers for all silicon parts, for silicon chips for like Intel and Microsoft. So they make these very large circular wafers. And I did an internship with them for 3 months in process engineering. And so that was a really great experience to see that I really did miss biology, but I learned a lot about process engineering. I learned a lot about what goes into really understanding the experimental components behind industry and process, and how chemistry with human management and technical management fits together to make an actual product. So that was an internship that I had. And then during my PhD, I continue doing biological research. So I do research in the NANS lab, and my research is in quantifying the shapes of the brain's immune cells, as well as in building databases to better connect neurotherapeutic methodologies to biological outcome. So that's what my main research focuses on. But also during my PhD, because I'm ChemE, I took a segue by doing a 1-year data science traineeship and a 12-week internship with Pacific Northwest National Laboratories. And that was actually in national security. So it was not biologically focused at all, even though I was doing a biologically focused PhD. But I did get to apply methodologies I've learned and developed in my PhD to my work with PNNL. And so that was a really fun opportunity. It allowed me to get better at data science, which is really important, but it also really solidified that I'm in ChemE because I like biology. And so I've really missed biology while I was doing that experience, but I'm very glad that I did do it.
Did those experiences make you mentioned that they made you a better chemical engineer, but were they helpful for being a chemical engineer focused on health?
Let's see. Being a process engineer definitely makes me a better engineer focused on health. Something you'll hear a lot in chemical engineering is high throughput. Like scale up is huge in engineering. How can you, as a chemist, you can make some formula, you can make some material, but as a chemical engineer, how do you make enough material of a therapeutic so that you can vaccinate the entire globe? Or how do you make enough material of that plastic or of that solar panel? So chemical engineers handle the scale up. And so when I was working in the silicon wafer industry, as a process engineer, I was very focused on scale up. I was very focused on systems. I learned a lot about the human component of everything you'll ever engineer, that there is always someone that will be doing the actual building or some technician, and you can never get away from that human component. And so that definitely made me a better engineer when I think about health. So now when I build things like my database that I've been building to connect neurotherapeutics to biological outcome, I think about it on a different scale. Like I think about it in all the units as in your unit ops class, but I also think about like the researcher who's doing each of those individual components. And I understand, because I'm flawed, that they are flawed. And so you have to account for, maybe they had a bad day and a therapeutic was just formulated incorrectly. This is an experimental lab, so you assume that's not happening. In industry and like making COVID vaccines, they have better quality checks for that. But so when building in a database for experimental labs or very preclinical work, it's how do you account for that kind of quality and research training? And how do you account also for this natural human process of, why did they think that experiment was a good follow-up from the experiment before that? And so working at Sumco really gave me a fantastic insight into that. Working in the national security sector, I did a ton of reading. I was given a lot of reading, a lot of podcasts. And so I learned about infrastructure security. So if you think about things like Hurricane Katrina, where hospitals were just flooded for days after the hurricane. I read a fantastic book about the floods in Hurricane Katrina. You get to think a lot about how engineering affects people on a larger scale. And so that was a huge change for me, that my research is quite focused on very little things. I study cells, which are very, very small, but having to remember how everything that I study fits into the bigger picture. So how my studying these cells relates to another researcher who's studying a specific disease, who relates to the other researchers who actually design medicine to treat each of those diseases. So I think that studying infrastructure through national security actually gave me a better point of view of how to study the larger process beyond just my laboratory of clinical development. So I think it definitely did help. I think that mindset of systems, that mindset of scale up, has moved into my research philosophy.
Cool. So you originally were planning to go to med school after you graduated from college, and you were not in med school, you were getting a PhD. Tell us more about how that changed for you.
I kind of knew from my probably freshman year that I wanted to be pre-med. I remember talking to an academic advisor about it in my first year, and them being like, okay, you need to care about the path and you need to get all of your volunteer hours. So from my freshman year, they were like, it's really easy to be pre-med and BME. So just stay here if you want to be a doctor. And so I had like built in like, okay, this is the one extra class that I'll have to take, or I think 3 extra classes or something like that. And I signed up for and did do rotations in cardiac surgery. I saw open heart surgeries. I did all the volunteer hospital hours. I changed beds. I moved patients across the hospital. I worked in a kidney dialysis center. I was working on biomedical research. I got so far as to the summer between my junior and senior year. I took the whole summer. I think I worked. I don't remember where I worked. I had a lot of odd jobs, so I might have been working at a pet resort at that time. And then the rest of my time, I studied for the MCAT, and I took the MCAT October of my senior year. I took it in August, and I got the results back in October. So October of my senior year, I got the MCAT back. And so the MCAT, when I took it, was an 8-hour long exam. And I remember going in and taking it in 4 hours. And not because I was super smart, but just because at that point I had just wanted it to be over. Like I spent 3 months studying for it. And then when I got to the exam, I just didn't see the point in taking the breaks. Like I just was like, let's plow through it, let it be over. So then I spent the next 2 months, I was waiting for my results, honestly, just quite hoping that I had failed it, which is not a good sign for wanting to go to medical school. But I knew I really liked medicine. I knew I really liked the prospect of studying for more years about medicine to get it and a deeper understanding, but I was really unhappy. And I had that thing in the back of my mind where if I fail, I don't have to apply to med school. Like that's just the end of this route. So I was in unit ops my senior year when I got my MCAT results back. And so I like stepped out and all my classmates knew that I was waiting for my MCAT results. And I got my score and I did pretty well. And I came back in, I was just crying. And everyone was like, oh my gosh, you didn't do well. Are you okay? And I was like, no, I actually did really well. And now it's like justified that I should apply. Like I didn't score perfectly, but I scored well enough to apply for a decent medical school. And I was just really like sad about that and realized that I really needed to reflect and decide what I really wanted to do and why I was really interested in becoming a doctor. So one of the reflections that I did was the MCAT is split into 4 sections. So there is biology, and then there's chemistry, physics, that's one section. And then there's critical reading, and then there is psychology, sociology. And so it makes sense that my second highest scoring section was chemistry and physics because we have the most chem and chemical engineering. But my first highest scoring section that I had never studied for and actually didn't miss a single question on was critical reading. And critical reading wasn't even about medicine necessarily. It was just a really fun section to me that just had a bunch of different science essays, and you just had to be able to read them and come up with kind of conclusions or figure out the author's hypothesis. And it didn't have to be about medicine. Some of it was about making pottery, and I loved the cars section. And then my lowest score, that one really balanced out. My lowest score was biology, and it was because I just hated the concept of having to memorize all of that biology just constantly. That's what was making me really unhappy, was memorizing all of these biochemical pathways. And then on the MCAT, you couldn't figure it out. You couldn't really work through it. It was just, did you have this thing memorized about amyloid beta plaques or did you not? So that was my first reflection. My second was that my PI, I talked to him and he said, there's some funding through the college that I had where you could apply for some conference funding. You should go to Student AICE. So Student AICE is a conference right before the annual conference of the American Institute for Chemical Engineers. So it's 3 days, a Friday, a Saturday, and a Sunday that overlap with the first day is Sunday of the actual academic convention. So I was like, okay, I'm going. I think I had less than a month to buy the tickets and get to Minnesota. And while I was there, it's just a bunch of panels about chemical engineering, and it's mainly academia, so mainly PhDs. There are a couple of MDs there. And there was a panel about nanotherapeutics and medicine. And that panel was just so cool to me. And I stayed after and I talked to one of the professors who is from Virginia. And she was just so nice about answering all of my questions about drugs and drug targeting and off-site effects and what is preclinical even mean, which is all the research that goes in before anything even hits like the FDA for clinical approval. And so that was really, really amazing. And then at Student AICE, you can actually talk to graduate schools about PhDs. And I had never thought about a PhD before. I thought kind of the only way to, I knew that my professors had PhDs, but it didn't occur to me that you could become a doctor with a PhD. Don't know why. I guess I just hadn't thought about it. So you can meet a bunch of different graduate schools at Student AICI. And so I just went there and started talking to professors, and they were super, super nice about helping me figure out research areas of interest. And I met a professor from Rice. I didn't even apply to Rice. And he was like, so you know what you want to do research in? And I was like, no, not really. And he took me to the side and he just offered me like two options, like an eye doctor's test, and was like, pick the one you want. So he was like, biology, energy. I was like, biology. He was like, okay, within biology, like materials, computational. I think back then I picked materials. And he just kind of went down the list. And then he said, here's some stuff that you should think about. So I called my parents. I was like, I think a PhD is for me. I have no idea what that means. Let me go figure it out. Emailed my undergrad research professor. It was the end of October. I think it was November 1st when I got back from Minnesota. And I was like, can we meet? I think I want to do a PhD. And he was like, yep, let's meet tomorrow at the Starbucks, which was in the first floor of his building. So he met me at a Starbucks, and I was like, I think I want to do a PhD, but I need to take a gap year because I haven't planned for this. I'm a big planner. And he goes, nope, you don't need to take a gap year. I'm your first letter of recommendation. Go walk around the campus and see if you can find two more. And then he goes, we were all kind of just waiting for you to decide that you wanted to do a PhD. And that was really because what I loved about medicine was that constant solving a puzzle, was reading the literature, like the critical reading in the MCAT, was just reading the literature and learning about it, piecing together these systems in my mind, talking about how science could further medicine, rather than what I should probably have realized, rather than like all the bedside of working with individual patients and coming up with their treatments or surgery or any of that wasn't really anything that I wanted to do, but I still loved medicine. And that's how I ended up on the PhD route. And then I applied for UW, and then I got into UW. And then amazingly, the week after I got into UW, they send me an offer and I find out that PhDs are paid for. I was like completely prepared because I was prepared for medical school. So I'd like looked into how you take out loans and how long it was going to take for me to pay back loans because I couldn't afford medical school. And so that was just absolutely wild. I remember calling my parents when I got in, because you get the offer letter of money after you get in. And someone had asked my mother, they were like, well, that's going to be expensive. And then I called my mom the next day and I was like, it's paid for. You get like a salary. And my mom went to her coworker who was really snooty. And she was like, not only is it paid for, but she also gets like a yearly stipend. So that was like a really cementing moment of, oh, this is something I can actually do and can afford to do, which is really nice.
Kind of a bummer that nobody mentioned that at student AICHE.
I think they thought that I knew.
I know. It's like one of those things that like, it's just like such a part of it that people assume that you would know.
Yeah. People definitely thought that I knew. When I tell people I didn't know until I got the offer letter, I was just because I'd been prepping for med school where you just assume you're going to take out hundreds of thousands of dollars of loans. So it was like, okay, this is med schools I can go to if I stay in Arizona where I grew up. Like I can live at home and take out less loans, which some of my friends are doing. And so that's what I had planned for. It was like, okay, how do you afford living? But yeah, I have that and I have health insurance. Crazy world. Crazy world.
Okay, so you mentioned the research that you're doing, but as somebody who's not a chemical engineer, I only understood a tiny bit of what you said that you do. So can you tell us a little more about what you're doing in your research, but maybe like aimed at the level of someone who like is not already an engineer?
Yep. So when you become a PhD student, you become a student in somebody's lab. So rather than taking a ton of classes, we only take about 6 classes. You're not really a student of like the department's curriculum, you're really a student of a lab's research area. So I joined Elizabeth Nance's lab, which focuses on developing nanotherapeutics for neonatal populations, which just means therapeutics, so medicine that are on the nanoscale. So a nanometer is 10 to the negative 9th of a meter. So a centimeter is 10 to the negative second. That's what a nanotherapeutic is. Just any therapeutic that's on that metric scale. And then neonatal population is any child from term birth up to, I think it's about 30 days. I might not be correct on that one, but it's right in between born and infant or pediatric. And so
Wait, I have a
Elizabeth,
question.
Dr. Mhm,
Does that include, you said term to 30 days? So does that not
mhm.
include preterm?
So I think in some contexts it does include preterm, so I might not be exactly
Okay.
correct about that. And we do research into premature babies. So I think it depends on the research context you're talking to. I think it depends. I don't know 100% on in medicine. I think like the NICU does handle premature babies, but it has to be born. Typically, it's not in the
I
not a
see.
baby in the womb.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, which may not be a term. So yes, we do handle premature, we do a lot of work in premature diseases. And so uh, why Elizabeth Nance chose neonatal populations is that in therapeutics, that's an underserved population, which means not a lot of people are engineering therapeutics for this population. Even though the population is quite large, they grow up quite quickly. Neurodevelopment happens quite quick when you're a child, like from neonatal to infant to child to teenager, your brain has changed quite a lot. So that's what the lab focuses on. Specifically, what I focus on within that lab is that we already have a lot of data. We already have developed therapeutics that we've tested in different animal models, but we could gain more insight from that data than we have. So I use data science, which is just mathematical and statistical methods for handling large amounts of data to get more information out of the data that already exists. So the first way I do that is we take a lot of images of brain cells with a fancy microscope. And so I do a lot of image processing or data science methodologies that allow us to better quantify shapes of cells so that we can learn about what the shape relates to therapeutics, to better process those images so that they're clearer for downstream analysis. And the other side of what I do is what I talked about, which was that database work where I better connect pieces of data that are kind of far apart in an experiment. So the methodologies that go into making a therapeutic, like the materials we used, how long you sonicate or shake that material for so that it's dispersed, to something like biological outcome, which is like how many cells have died. So I build databases, which is a method of handling numbers, data, variables, so we can better connect and then run statistical analysis on those types of things.
Cool.
Hopefully that was clear.
Yes. And the goal with data science is to make connections that it might take a human like a lifetime to make, or that might be impossible for humans to see because the patterns are so like large, the data
Yeah.
sets are so large that it's not possible for a human to
Yeah.
see it.
Sometimes the data sets are really large. That's like the common pop sci way that we think of needing to handle data science, is because data science is like sets are really large. Like if you think of like Amazon uses a ton of data science in order to predict what products you're going to like, to handle their customers, all of that.
That defines why we need data science. And so some of those are volume, which is just how much you have, but then you also have velocity. So how quickly is data produced? So if you're talking about Amazon, it's produced constantly. People are constantly clicking, constantly buying. If you're talking about biological research, your velocity changes a little bit, in that if you're talking about Alzheimer's research in a rat, you're going to have to wait years for that rat to get old enough that Alzheimer's or age-related diseases kick in. So it's a different kind of velocity. If you're talking about Alzheimer's research in a human, that's going to be multiple researchers that actually have to study generations of people. So it's a very different velocity of data. Like data is constantly being generated by animals and humans living, developing, processing, but how often that data enters a way that we can analyze it is different. The other V's are veracity, so truth. It's not a very big deal if Amazon or Instagram recommend you an ad you don't click on.
Whatever. It's a really big deal if we tell you that you have a rare genetic disorder that you don't have, and then you change your life because of that. Something that I worked on in undergrad. It's a really big deal if you get a false negative COVID test. So veracity has a different meaning in biology. And then the other two, I should remember them. I just published a paper including them. Veracity, volume, velocity, variability. Variability in biology is huge. Therapeutics in the brain, which is what I study, change from region to region in the brain. So your brain has different regions that are in charge of different things, and how transport occurs and how cell uptake occurs in those regions is different. And I talked about neurodevelopmental ages. So the brain is very different as you develop and as you are a full adult, but then also it's different in response to stress, and it's different in response to chronic stress, which is different than just acute stress. And it's also different when you get older. So you have to keep in mind a lot of variability. And then you also have to keep in mind in biology, we have a lot of different types of data. So we have behavioral data. Like if you want to study a therapeutic, you need to understand the materials of that therapeutic, something chemical engineering does very well. You understand the chemistry behind it. You need to understand how we make it and mass produce it. You'll learn that in chemical engineering very well. Then you also need to be able to test that in an animal, where you're going to have quantitative values like how many cells die, but you're going to have other values like how does that animal's behavior change. And then when you finally get to a human, you have things like quality of life. Like if you have a drug that doesn't necessarily cure a disease, does it make someone's life better? And how do you quantify quality of life? And what does that mean? And how do you then compare that data to something else? So that's what big data and data science handles. And I think it's something that chemical engineering teaches you to handle quite well. And then in the biological relevance, you get to repackage it in a cool way. I think it's cool.
Yeah, it is cool. I think I've been thinking a lot about how like data science is this buzzword and like every field is using data science, but the emphasis in ChemE on scale, both across like size and time scale, is really like a strong match for like kind of the data science like perspective of ways.
Yeah, data science is definitely a buzzword, but it's kind of just the next step of math. Like just as statistics is important for everything, data science is a combination of mathematics, statistics, modeling to do the next step. So it seems very buzzy, but it's kind of going to fit into everything. Something I learned at not adult AICHE, because you're adults when you're students, but annual AICHE, like the full professional conference last week, is actually convolutional neural networks, which are a deep learning method. So in machine learning, there's a type of learning called deep learning, which is just machine learning with more layers and components to it. Convolutional neural networks are a huge buzzword in data science, and they're very much associated with computer science. But Venkat Subramanian, who's a professor at Columbia, pointed out that the first convolutional neural network was published in a chemical engineering journal, because chemical engineers had already been taught numerical methods. We already had a lot of data. We already needed to know how some thermodynamic value from upstream was going to affect your later product further on. And so we've been working on data science methods for a significantly long amount of time in comparison to some fields. And so it is a buzzword, but it's a very natural step from chemical engineering curriculum.
So when we first talked about having this conversation, and I do want us to like wrap it up sort of soon so we can take questions from people who joined us, but you talked a little bit about the history of chemical engineering and how in of that like critical reading, you had found some cool things. And I thought when you talked about that history, it really helped understand better kind of like what perspective chemical engineers bring and what's so special about it. So I wondered if you could kind of like walk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, so chemical engineering, and I don't know all the exact dates because I'm bad at dates, but they basically, chemical engineering emerged first from people who were pretty much working as technicians or mechanics. And so there were a bunch of people working across a bunch of different fields in different plants, industrial plants at the time, that needed to know how to make this material or needed to know how to make this oil, and they would be trained on the job in order to do that. So some of the first programs were in London and then at MIT, where some professors noticed, although they're making different things, the units that they use to make them are the same. So they noticed that things like the separation systems, you need to separate a gas from a liquid or gases with different vaporization temperatures, those are the same. So it started out of this idea of separating systems into common units that all systems followed. And then beyond that, what really took ChemE into kind of the next steps of not just a method of training, but into an entire curriculum is, now that you have these unit ops, more researchers and scientists added in, well, all of these unit ops are guided by thermodynamic principles and by transport principles. So all materials act by some laws of physics, and all materials move by some laws of physics. And so that really became the transport and thermodynamic components. And then was added in that numerical methods component of, okay, but we're not doing this on a small scale, it's quite a large scale. And we're beyond the point where you can just by hand write all these numbers down all the time. So how do you use computers? How do you use better graphing? How do you use better charts in order to understand these thermodynamic principles and how they change when you go from making 1 ounce of something to thousands of gallons of something? And how to use numerical methods to keep track of that process through scale up and all across that pipeline. And then as chemical engineering really grew, more people from chemical engineering continued dispersing into other fields. And it's actually bioengineering and material science engineering that emerged out of chemical engineering, out of people that took these principles and applied them in different ways and added more to the curriculum as well, in order to have these two really specific focuses.
Cool. And so when you were talking about the way things act and the way things move, is that basically thermodynamics is the way things act and transport processes is the way things move?
Yeah, transport is a lot about flow. It's a lot about things that stop flow, why flow is slow. And thermodynamics is a lot about material composition. It's a lot of physics. And the two work together. Like, you have to account for both, but that's the real like breakdown. Hello,
Very
Mimi.
cool. So I can ask some more questions if people don't have questions, but I want to open it up to the group to either put questions in the chat or which for some reason I can't open right now. So I'm gonna have to minimize
I can
my
open it.
my computer's kind of, anyway, questions in the chat or raise your hand. My Zoom has just gone completely bizarre, so I can't see anything right now. So you're gonna have to manage it, Holly. I might leave and come back actually.
That's okay. Hello, everyone. You can ask any questions that you want to.
Hi, my name's
Hi.
Kevin. My name's
Hi,
Kevin.
Kevin.
I'm a chemical engineering student at Edmonds. So I have a couple superficial questions and then a couple of kind of opportunity questions, kind of, 'cause I'm still deciding between schools that I'm going to transfer to. To get the superficial ones out of the way, you know, what avenues of chemical engineering would you say are lucrative in terms of, I mean, I know that oil, obviously there's a lot of money in oil, but I've heard that I have a buddy who actually graduated from UW with a chemical engineering degree, And he said that oil is just, it's just painful. Like you have to like live there on site for most of them, and
Yeah, so like what can you make a lot of money in chemical engineering? Is
right.
that kind of the question? Yeah, so I mean, if you just look at how much chemical engineers make, we're already in that top amount of how much money you can make. It's actually less money for me to go to graduate school than it is for me to have gone straight into industry. So I have friends straight out of undergrad who make six figures, which is pretty crazy. And they're in different fields. So one went into cosmetics, one went into work at in the silicon industry, one is in the aerospace industry. So you can definitely make a lot of money in chemical engineering. You can
Aerospace,
also
that's
take
very cool.
chemical engineering. Yeah, chemical engineers can pretty much go and work anywhere. You're kind of needed at any chemical plant. You'll have to be near the plant, but there's plants like everywhere. There's plants in California, there's plants in Arizona. There's a lot of plants in Arizona. There's no fault lines there. That's why Arizona State sends a lot of students to chemical companies around there. And so you can make a pretty decent amount of money just with a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering. Um, Other things you can do with chemical engineering, and we've actually had an industry panelist who was a chemical engineer who's gone into venture capitalism. So you can actually, and I've had friends that go into consulting from chemical engineering. So you can go into consulting firms and they have a lot of money and they'll send you to travel internationally because you understand fundamental science. So it doesn't matter what fields they're throwing at you. Like you can get a biological problem and understand the thermodynamics and do some research to know if it's feasible or not. Or you can get an energy problem or an oil problem, or you can look at people's credentials and you can start to understand, okay, is this solid science or is it not? So consulting is a big field. You can get a law degree, or they have shortened law degrees. I don't really know how it works, and go into patent law. And so I've heard that's pretty economically feasible. So I wouldn't worry about getting a job in chemical engineering and not living a comfortable life. I have friends in major cities. I have friends in small towns. Most of them have just picked where they want to live.
Most of our alumni who work in oil don't live on oil rigs or anything like that either.
Okay, I have a buddy who he actually graduated, it was a while ago. He graduated like 8, 9, 10 years ago from UW with a chemical engineering degree. He said that he had some friends that did oil and they make, you know, a great amount of money, but they have to like leave there, so that they can't really have families because they have to leave for like 3, 4 weeks at a time, and they have to, and then they can come back and do it. They have freedom to do whatever they want for a week or two, but then they have to go back for another month. And so
I think
Yeah, I
that's
wouldn't.
going to be the minority for sure. Like there are lots of oil jobs that don't involve that. And then I would say like 90% of our students don't do jobs in oil.
right.
Yeah, I
And
think
what would you say most of them do?
Um,
Nicole would better answer that one. I don't know if maybe did.
that's a great question. So I think that it's a big mix. There's, you know, like Hawley said, a lot of it is chemical plants, but there's a wide variety of, is that making food or packaging or paper or biotherapeutics or batteries. We also have a lot of people who work at Boeing. Boeing has a lot of need for chemical engineers, both in terms of like how they're processing things, but the coatings that they're making, improving the like environmentally friendliness of that, improving
And
their
airflow.
and
I have friends.
airflow.
I have friends that work on airflow dynamics, which is a type of flow, but just of gas and not liquids.
Very cool.
So yeah, really wide variety. And we have a great website, which you might have seen, but if you go to our ChemE website and you go to undergraduates careers in ChemE, there's a lot to look at and read about.
Great. Also, okay, got that one out of the way. It's such a like hard to bring that type of topic up sometimes, but
Oh, it's fine. It's a good. You need to have those conversations. It's a good
right.
topic. I'm fine with it.
Okay, cool. Also, so you know, many schools kind of specialize in what kind of, or not, it's not their intention, I think, what they specialize in. I think it just happens. But what most companies recruit out of their schools. And do you know which companies recruit chemies from UW? Because I particularly am obviously not as to the extent that you are, but I'm interested in pharmaceuticals. So whatever
Yes.
internships or companies that.
So there are companies that recruit specifically out of certain universities, and I'll let Nicole probably hit on that one better than I can. But you have to keep in mind, like for a state university, it's most likely going to be the companies that are nearby, as it makes sense for them, or in the state, so not like necessarily right close. It makes sense for them to want to support the state infrastructure and to take students from the nearby schools. And there are a lot of pharmaceutical startups and companies here in Seattle, and there are a lot of biotech companies here in Seattle. I mean, the Allen Brain Institute is one of the like top brain places to study the brain. Isn't I think Amgen's up here. There's a ton of just Nanosite is up here. There's a ton of different pharmaceutical companies. But that being said, I went to a state university in undergrad, and a lot of students did get recruited to the companies that were nearby, but a decent number of students also got recruited to companies that weren't in the area as well. So there is definitely a connection of companies that specifically recruit for UW students. But I've seen in my friends from ChemE that there's a lot of people that just want chemies, and they don't care really what kind of specific specialty is around the area your school is in.
And
I'll
I'll
let
add,
Nicole.
we have some lists on our careers page of some of our like most common companies. And like Hawley said, the Seattle biotech industry is huge here and desperate for chemical engineers. Like they come and talk to us and they're like, we need more chemical engineers. And we're like, who else are you talking to? And they're like, what other majors would we talk to? We're looking for chemical engineers. That's what we need. We need help with the processes. There is a company here, and I cannot remember the name off the top of my head, but it's on our careers page that they do like prototyping manufacturing. So they're like constantly retooling for a new pharmaceutical prototype. And then the company does the trials. And before the company that comes, their client comes to them and is like, can you manufacture this until we go through the trials and decide if it's worth building our own factory for this, because it's not worth it if it's not going to make it through the trials. And so they're like constantly doing these like new processes, which is pretty cool. And I also want to make time for some more questions that are like more specifically about what Hawley shared, if people have them, and then we can come back to more questions about jobs. But people can also check out our careers page and make appointments with me for like much longer conversations about careers if that's what you want, just because Hawley's only here this one time and her expertise is a lot more specific. Are there any other questions? Because if not, we can go back to Kevin's.
I do know Megan. Megan's been able to pick my brain quite a lot as she is in our lab. I definitely have chatted with Megan quite a few
I see we've
times.
lost a few people too. Kevin, did you have more questions about that?
Not really. It's all mostly about internships and I'm going to be a transfer student, so I was kind of curious what type of opportunities I guess would be available, because I'm only there for 1 quarter before summer, because the transfer is only in spring. So
I have some answers for that, and I would love to share them with you. You can find the link to set up an appointment, or you can email me again on our website, and we can talk more, because there's a lot I'd like to share with you.
Right. Cool.
I do actually have a question now. Hawley, I know you talked about wanting to go into academia in the future. Why do you choose academia over like a job in industry? Like, what is your like preference for?
So I, had 2 internships in industry. So I worked at Sumco and I was a process engineer. And I was actually given quite a lot of independence in my internship at Sumco. I found that some internships go that way, where they don't really think that you'll make a difference, but if you do, they're quite happy about it. So they kind of just go, here's a project we've been meaning to get to and we don't have a ton of time, see what you can do. So it was like, I didn't have meetings I had to check into. I had quite a lot of fun in that internship, and that I just did whatever I wanted. But when I was in my Sumco internship, I was improving a process, which was quite fun. It was a puzzle, what was going wrong, uh, but I wasn't designing the process, and I was pretty low on the totem pole of, and by pretty low, at the bottom of the totem pole of what the company was going to work on, the next things that should be improved, processes that should be designed and added in. So I definitely knew I needed at least a master's degree in order to start making those decisions. And then I went for a PhD because I really like the research side. I really like being able to make decisions about kind of where I think research is going, and exploring in those ways and doing something no one has done before. And then the further I've gotten into my PhD, I think I told Elizabeth Nance like outright that I thought I wanted to be a professor. I've wavered on that a little, so I did PNNL, which I
more authority because I had finished my master's degree at that point and was a third year in my PhD. And so I got more, like I got to do more research, which was fun. So I got that aspect of what I wanted. I got to read literature and decide kind of what the cutting edge was, but I still wasn't making decisions of what research was being done on. I had a lot of meetings there. I had like check-in meetings, I had progress meetings. People be working on this, the budget is here for this is where you're going to fit in. And I just didn't have that independence. So I'm interested really in academia because as a PhD student, I picked my lab and I was happy that my lab picked me as well. And in there, as long as I'm making some effort towards the lab's overall goal, which is improving neonatal health, I have a lot of independence in, oh, I saw this cool paper, let me just go try it out for a couple of weeks. And can't do that in industry. You have to reach the budget. You have to make money. You don't just have time to try things out for a couple of weeks if you want to. You don't really have a ton of room to fail in industry because you have to meet quotas. And so that's something that's really nice. The other side about academia is I also get to teach. So you're in the lab, but I've developed a laboratory education curricula where I actually teach like basically 15 modules, which are the equivalent of a class on image processing that's related to my research. And that's been so fun. And I get to mentor. I mentor 8 undergraduate students. I get to help them in their professional development. I get to help them develop research projects. And then moving forward into the future as a professor, it is a lot of writing. You have to write all your own grants and you have to bring in a lot of money and you have to write publications, but you get to kind of decide where your research area is going. You get to be at that cutting edge. You get to go to conferences and talk about science. And you do go to conferences, some in industry as well. You can get into those positions. But you get to peer review what is cutting edge science and you get to look it up and analyze it for statistics. And you're seen as doing cutting edge work. And that just is like really, really cool. No one checks what time I come into work. I had to be into work at the exact same time at my internship, and they checked how many hours you work, and you have to budget the hours in the specific way. As a PhD student, you're pretty much trusted that as long as you're making some kind of progress, come in whenever you want, do kind of whatever you want. And so you get to work more naturally with the flow of motivation and the flow of projects, which is fun.
I have a follow-up. Thank you for that response. I think that's really helpful in seeing the differences. But a follow-up question would be, I know in like industry, yeah, you have to like meet these specific target goals and like fit in the budget. For as a PhD student, what is like success for you, like by your thesis date, for example? Like what does success look like for a PhD student?
Oh, yeah. So that's harder to explain. So you're going to have whatever your PI defines as success. So that's going to be different from every single research lab. My PI, Elizabeth, she doesn't require any manuscripts. I'm totally going to missay something because I just don't have these memorized. She doesn't require manuscripts, but I believe you have to have made intentional progress in that direction. So they have like specific successes you have to hit in your PhD. You have exams that you have to pass. You have like an oral presentation that you have to pass. You have to give your defense and be able to answer questions in front of a committee. I think the overall success of your PhD is contributing to science. success for me in my PhD, I've become a better writer. Every time that I write something new and I realize that the words are more clear, that the science makes more sense, that the words are more logical, that what I'm saying in my aims is actually an aim and my hypotheses make more sense, that's huge for me. When I'm able to balance handling multiple projects at a better time, that's success for me. I like publishing manuscripts. That feels pretty good. We submitted one today. It makes me quite happy. And also seeing my undergrads get to explore and grow as researchers, that's success for me. Like seeing them work on a research project and feel confident in it, seeing them present on their work and seeing the literature reviews they've done and how they've grown into their concept of what the field is and where they want to go and what makes them happy about their careers. That's a big success thing to me as well. It's growth. In your PhD, it's all about growth. As a professor, you have to worry about budgets. You have to fund your students. There's more there. But in your PhD, someone else does most of that and you just grow as a human being. And that's really fun.
Sweet. Yeah, thank you for that response too. I think I appreciate your honesty and transparency there. And yeah, that's all the questions I had, but thank you so much for your talk,
Thanks,
Hawley.
Megan.
See you later. Have a good day.
Bye.
Thanks, Nicole.
Thanks. Okay, before we hop off, first of all, thank you so much. That was
Can we
really
stop the
wonderful.
recording.
Yes, let's stop the recording.